Hello, it's Jack Tutor here of Attention Magazine. Welcome to Crucial Listening, the podcast where I speak with musicians and sound artists about 3 albums that are important to them. My guest this time is Olivia Block, media artist and composer based in Chicago. Olivia's new album, Innocent Passage in the Territorial Sea, is out now on Room 40. A record, as we mentioned in the early part of this conversation, that was put together over lockdown and informed in part by Olivia's experiences on psychedelic mushrooms. Feels to me like a record that pays homage to the power of generating internal universes inside the mind with their own forces, their own dynamics, their own languages. It's got this beautiful internal logic to it. Different parts of the record feeding into other bits, informing others, this kind of cyclical, circumventory energy going on. Really enjoying that one. So head over to oliviablock.net, that's Olivia's website. Head over to oliviablock.bandcamp.com, where you can hear the record. And obviously head over to attentionmagazine.co.uk/crucial listening for links to Olivia's picks and her music. Thank you for listening. Head over to ko-fi.com/crucial listening to donate to the podcast, keep everything ticking by. And thank you, as always, for your support. Hope you enjoy this episode. This is Olivia Block on Crucial Listening. Hello, Olivia. Welcome to Crucial Listening.
Thank you so much. I'm happy to be here.
Great to have you. So we're going to talk about 3 important records. But first, I want to ask about your new album, Innocent Passage in the Territorial Sea, which is out on Room 40. So I want to start with a few of the details that included with the press release of this, one of which is about you adopting a practice of listening with intention while on psychedelic mushrooms during lockdown. So how did you arrive at this practice, and what was the appeal in this practice for you?
Well, it was kind of, it was good timing, or terrible timing. I don't know. It depends on which you choose. But right before the lockdown, I had decided that I wanted to take some mushrooms just because I thought it would be an interesting thing to do. And so a friend of mine had a person who could, supply me with some mushrooms, who grew them. And this is all very sordid. You have to get into the details of how you actually get the mushrooms to talk about it. But it's actually totally fine. It's there's no dark alley or anything like that. It's just this guy's just grows mushrooms and he's really into plants. So so I got some, and then basically the lockdown happened and everything was canceled. So I was just home all the time, and I decided to just take some of these mushrooms, and I had a lot of them. I just basically got too many. And so I took them, and then I was just working in my studio, and I have this this vintage organ that I really like that's on the new album a lot. It's very powerful. It's this analog organ that Korg made that mimics the Hammond B3. So it has these overtone bars that you can pull, and when you pull the overtone bars, more overtones. It's almost like a pipe organ where you can hear more overtones as you pull out the bars.
Right.
So you start with the root note, and then you can slowly bring in these overtones. So I noticed as I was doing these mushrooms, I wasn't tripping, and I wasn't microdosing. It was somewhere kind of between those two things, so that my senses were just hyper aware of sound in this totally different way than I had experienced before. So when I was changing the sound by bringing in each overtone, like I could feel on my skin even like the changes in the air, and it was just this completely different embodied way of listening.
Wow.
And I thought, wow, this is really interesting. And that process kind of led the entire album, because I was playing these chords and notes that my body was responding to in that way. And those kind of patterns and notes then became like the fundamental parts of each of the songs in the record. And then the other thing that I was doing is just being outside a lot and kind of noticing like how I could feel plants and things like that. And it just made me, in this corny way, very just happy to be alive and be on the planet at this moment, and just looking around and seeing that everything is just verdant and beautiful, and there are trees with leaves on them, and it might not be like that forever. So I was appreciating that more on the mushrooms.
And when you were working in the studio on mushrooms, I don't know how easy this is going to be to articulate, if it is at all, but was there anything specific that you felt yourself being compelled towards sonically, or anything that really came into focus when you were on mushrooms that perhaps didn't outside of that experience?
Yes, I think the bass, the really, really low bass frequencies were way more appealing to me than they usually are. And certain kinds of repetition also of the bass patterns were also appealing to me, where they usually were not before. And there were just certain, in a way, you know, it's funny because I think when people think of an artist doing mushrooms or psychedelics, you might assume that the work or the music or whatever gets a lot weirder and more psychedelic. But for me, it was actually just the opposite. It kind of just focused my work into these tonal centers and these kind of intervals, like intervallic relationships between notes that I just felt in my body. So it's more... it's much more of a tonal album than most of my work, and that's because of the mushrooms.
Another element that seems to have played quite a prominent part is you rereading Anneke Van's Ice over lockdown as well, which is a book that I really enjoyed actually when I read it a few years back. I mean, what was it that drew you to the book, and what was it that appealed in the book to you?
I think, well, for one, I'm glad you read the book and loved it. I think it's so good, and it's kind of like an underground thing. Like, a lot of people know about it, but it never quite. It's not like even Octavia Butler or something like. You know, it's just a strange book, because it's almost. I mean, people call it science fiction, but it's not even science fiction, really. It's just more like surreal. Yeah. You know, and I really like it because I tend to think in terms of impressions. Like, I don't really think in terms of stories or narrative or language. I just think in terms of like impressions with images and emotions attached to those. And that book was really, to me, kind of designed that way. It was just like... You know, it was just like these strange scenes that didn't quite make sense, but there were these repetitions of these images with the ice, and then this girl who just can't even tell if this is a real person, or it was almost like this hyper subjective, unreliable narrator, which I thought was very interesting. You know, like, he's like a complete creep, actually. But also, I just loved this idea of like ice taking it over everything. Like, it's usually, because we're so used to our narrative of global warming where everything's melting, and this was kind of just the opposite, you know, which I found kind of very intriguing.
Yeah, and it sounds like that this or was maybe involved in the generation of like a speculative sci-fi narrative that you came up with. I mean, I heard as well that in collaborating with Jan St. Werner, you kind of outlined some of this to him. I mean, I would understand if maybe it's not something you want to pour out into the opening and leave people to kind of figure out their own imagery and stuff, but Is there any details that you could tell me about this kind of sci-fi world that you had in mind when you were doing this record?
Well, the funny thing is that I think the sci-fi world that I had in mind was our world. I mean, our world became a sci-fi world. So it was almost more like I was just making a soundtrack to kind of understand what was happening, you know, because it was just so strange and awful and surreal. So it almost just kind of became like the most sensible thing to do, you know. So I didn't necessarily like have a different landscape in mind. It was just more trying to conceive of all of the complicated things that were happening.
One thing that also piqued my interest is you talk about using a broken mellotron. How was it broken?
Oh, it was so cool. I love this mellotron so much. It was I recorded this mellotron at Electrical Audio here in Chicago, and which is Albini's studio.
Yeah.
And so it's got all of these instruments in it, and I had this recording of this mellotron there, which basically didn't play right in that the reel-to-reel tapes for each note of each instrument were kind of like would stop and start, and they sounded really warped and strange. And so so basically it was just like wrong. It didn't sound the way that a mellotron was supposed to sound, but I kind of became attached to the warped quality of it because it just seemed to fit in with the world, that everything is just strange and grotesque and warped. And you know, like on one hand, there's just this whole world of like social media and everything seems very grotesque there. And then the other world is this weird lockdown where you can't touch anything or go anywhere or see anyone. And so it was just like, yeah, it just felt like, where was I going with that? I forgot the question.
Oh, yes, how the mellotron was broken.
Oh, yeah. So, right. So it just felt like an appropriate kind of sound where like the broken tape, the kind of delicate broken tape just became like a symbol in my mind for the world just being broken and delicate. But to explain quickly about what a mellotron is, in case anyone doesn't know, so a mellotron is an instrument that was very popular in like the 70s, and you hear it on many iconic rock records. Like you can hear it in Kashmir by Led Zeppelin. So it's a keyboard that has reel-to-reel tapes inside of samples of instruments so that you can create these like orchestral layers of like orchestral instruments, but they're actually tapes. So when you press down on a note, you're actually making the mechanics of the tape go. And so of course, you know, you can imagine like there's no way that these things are going to stay in time and in speed. They're going to slow down, they're going to speed up. And so, so it's kind of a wonderful instrument.
That's so wild. I didn't know about the mechanics of that, but that seems wholly impractical. That's so cool.
Ridiculous. I know. It's really funny that there was such a thing as a mellotron. I mean, I think the Beatles used the mellotrons too, and so it kind of it goes with that time period where people were enamored with reel-to-reel tape and like all of these things that you could do with it, you know, as a material, which was a wonderful time in music. I mean, that was just because reel-to-reel tape is just still nothing sounds like it. I mean, when you record on a really thick reel-to-reel tape, it just sounds different. So there's that kind of homage as well. And
you also released a track, as I said, you collaborated with Jan St. Werner, a track called Kine. How did you come to work with Jan?
Well, I've known Jan for a while, and he's just a person that I, first of all, just really like as a person. I think he's just lovely, and I know his wife, who's a very talented visual artist. And he's been super supportive of my work for a long time. Like he just kind of, you know, finds artists that he likes and he supports them, and he did that with me. And I also just love his work. I think he does really interesting things with sound. And so I found this, I was thinking like, oh, this would be the perfect record to bring Jan in, like, and see what he could do with this material. And I had this extra track where I just did this almost like, it's a very somber sounding organ line. It almost sounds pipe organ-esque. And it uses the same 7 notes that I use basically on the entire record. So I gave Jan the track with the organ, and he was into it. He liked the tracks from the record. And so he took the organ track and he kind of layered these sounds that sound almost incongruous with the organ. Like they almost exist on this totally different level. And I thought it was amazing. Like, I really loved what he did. It was so strange and like perfectly it was like the perfect thing for like a science fiction soundtrack. And he was at that time kind of listening to a lot of Roland Kane. I don't know how to say his last name actually, but yeah, Kayn. And his, because Jim O'Rourke just released a lot of his works. And so I think that Jan was very influenced by Roland Kane's work. And that kind of came into the mix as well, which also seemed totally perfect. So it's just this really interesting track that has these 2 layers that are almost like going against each other, but then they also work. It's very interesting.
Awesome. Well, I absolutely love the new record. I'm looking forward to hearing that track with Jan as well. I think what I love most is knowing it in the context of you having read Anna Kavan's book. That's got such a specific internal logic to it, which seems to belong to that universe and almost like a little snow globe, it just doesn't touch the outside. Your record has, for me, that kind of sensation as well, of just these lines of interconnection that exclusively kind of connect within itself, which is so compelling. I absolutely love it.
Thank you. I'm so glad. Yeah, that's the way I see it too. It's just its own world.
Wicked. Well, I thoroughly encourage people to check it out. When this broadcasts, it will be out, so do go check it. It's on Room 40, like I say. Olivia, let's go to your 3 important records. And one question I like to ask before we go into the records specifically is how you thought about the term important when picking your list of records. So was there a way that you understood important in order to come up with the list that you did?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't want to use the list as an opportunity to give you my favorite all-time records, because sometimes I think that that's not as interesting as just picking some things that I think are just interesting. There's really interesting records for either completely musical reasons or for reasons outside the music, like maybe because the composer is kind of interesting or something like that. So I kind of took that approach.
Nice. Okay, well, let's go for one of the records specifically then. Which one do you want to go for first?
Cool. Let's go for the Alemu Aga, that's the Ethiopic Volume 11, where Alemu Aga plays the Harp of David.
Yes. So, let's start with, if you could give me a little introduction as to why this album is important to you.
Well, first, I think it's just absolutely stunning. I love this record so much, just the way it sounds. I think that the tonal palette is very narrow. And so I think I connect this record in a way with my album coming out now, because there's only very few notes are used on this Harp of David, which is almost like a lyre. It's like a big, it's a sacred instrument that is used in Ethiopian religious ceremony and Christian Orthodox Ethiopia practice. Just kind of butchered the way that sounded. But so people use this Harp of David when they're like meditating and doing these very like internal kind of prayers and things. It's not really used in church services. It's more used like in the home. And so I think that part of the beauty of the sound of the record is that it really sounds like that. Like it's a very intimate sound. Everything is closely mic'd, and there's just a few notes being plucked at a time. And Alemo Aga's voice is just very beautiful. It's like he's singing a lullaby or something in every track. Yeah.
Do you remember how you first discovered the record?
Yeah, I mean, basically anything in that series, in the Ethiopic series, I will buy. I just think that it's one of the best series of music of any kind ever, in my opinion. Just everything is just like a revelation. And I love, that series kind of pulled me in with the more jazz-focused records. But then this one, I just heard it because it was in the series. And then I was like, wow, this is really different, actually. This is like a really special sound.
Mm. Yeah. Do you remember when you first came into it? How long has it been in your life?
Oh, gosh, it's been at least 10 or I want to say 10 years, 12 years, something. So I think I discovered it after it had already come out.
Right.
But then it was just like one that I didn't have in my collection or something. And then I heard it and I was like, and I remember hearing it and then sharing a link on Facebook, and everyone was just completely like, oh, what is this? This is so beguiling. I've never heard anything like this before, because it just has this really enchanting sound.
Yeah. And it's about like, is it like an hour long, the record? Just centered on this, as you say, this really narrow instrument palette. I feel like you get into such a state of intimacy with the sound of that instrument just over the course of, the duration of a single listen. Let alone, I haven't spent a lot of time with it, so let alone 10 years. But
it's almost like I don't think of it in the way, or I don't listen to it in a way that I listen to other albums necessarily, because it's so... It doesn't have, again, like sort of back to this idea of narrative and how I don't really think in that way. It's kind of like a non-narrative sound. Like it just kind of floats and it doesn't really change. But there are sort of things that dip in and out, and maybe the key changes on one of the tracks, but every track sounds alike. So essentially it's kind of like a drone record with like singing on top.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm intrigued about that actually, because I've seen you mention... Oh, I wish I could remember which release it was in reference to. I think it was October 1984, where you say, or it's at least listed in the liner notes, that you kind of offer a suggestion of a different form of listening, and it's like you might dip out of the record and come back in again. Is that the kind of listening that you adopt with this record as well? It feels kind of, my initial acquaintance, it's kind of built for that, this sort of chicaning listening of like dipping and increasing concentration.
Definitely. And I think, and I don't mean dipping in and out as if like it's in the background. I mean, it really does feel like something you could meditate to, where you maybe you could use this music as the focus of the meditation, and at some points you're focused on it and you're really concentrating, and then you kind of lose that focus, but then you come back and the music is kind of still there, holding the same kind of patterns and tensions that it had before.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it is like that.
I love that. That's my favorite thing, where you're like, it almost stretches around you. You're like, you could leave the room and come back.
Thinking of it. Yeah, I like that. That's a nice image. Yeah, that is really how it feels.
And this instrument, so, I mean, had you, I believe, and, I don't know, I may have heard other things with it, but this is the first time I've heard this instrument. It's such a interesting tone, like that buzz that accompanies each of the string plucks. I think there's like a leather thong like between the strings, it's just causing this buzzing, right? But what is it you like about the tone of this instrument as well?
Well, I love that it sounds like something in Western music that is wrong. Like it sounds like if you detune a string too much and it slaps against the fretboard or something like that.
Right. Yes.
But in this case, it's just adding this really beautiful timbral element to the note, because it's not like a bell-like tone. It's like this buzzing, like there's the tone and then there's a buzzing kind of timbre on top of it, which is really interesting and something you don't, or at least I don't necessarily associate with like, liturgical music or anything like that, or hymns. Yeah. So it's really cool.
Yeah. And I think you touched on it, his voice as well is unbelievable. There's his moments where like it dips down to like such a low note, he just starts whispering.
Yes.
Which is just the first time it happened, it just completely took me back. That was incredible.
I know. It's just mesmerizing. I mean, it's part of this mesmer music. So I think like I'm actually really curious about how this was recorded. Like he must have been really close to the mic,
Yeah.
So even just the recording of it has some similarities to kind of like almost like lowercase jazz, or like,
right.
The kind of very quiet, like a new music that's happening now. So there are some similarities with the approach to the very close, like you can almost hear like the plucking of the strings,
Mm-hmm.
And as you say, like the whisper, you can hear that. It's very delicate.
Yeah. Tell me about this Ethiopic series as well. So like what else is in this collection?
Well, it's the most well known for like kind of jazz ensembles that most of them came out, I think, in the like 70s, 60s, 70s, that kind of era, and a lot of like groups that use like traditional like jazz instruments and almost have like traditional jazz kind of formation, but they use the tonality and the harmonic, structures of Ethiopia, which is really interesting because they use completely different modes, and their modes and scales are just really cool. They're so like, there's this kind of this one exuberant kind of mode. I'm trying to remember which one it is. Like there's a few different, there's Tazita, which is one. I think that might be it, but it's just like the happiest. It sounds really silly, but it's just a very exuberant like scale that they use. And it's just like a lot of kind of saxophones just going up and down the scale. And it's just lovely, beautiful music. It's very enchanting.
Well, I'm going to have to check out more of that. That sounds fab.
It's not just like jazz ensembles. I think that's what it's the most well known for, but there's also other solo instruments too. Like there's one piano record that I really love that's played by this woman who is actually a nun. She's still alive, and I'm blanking on her name, but I'll give it to you if you want to put it in the note, because that's another one of my favorites of this series. So.
ካሊነትም ክብርም ናቸውና ያንተ ገንዘቦች ሁሉም ለዓለም ወለዓለም ዓለም አሜን። የተላከው ቅዱስ ገብርኤል ከጌታ ሰላም ለኪ ብሎ በሰጠሽ ሰላምታ እኔ ባሪያሽ ልብሴን ስታጠቅ ስፈታ ሰላም ልልሽ።
Olivia, let's go to your second important record now. Which one do you want to go for?
Cool. Let's go to the Beatrice Ferreira. I never know if I'm pronouncing her name correctly, but so the Huellas Entreveradas, which means intertwined footprints. Yeah, I'm sure I'm completely butchering that. I'm sorry, but
better job than I would have done. So give me a little intro as to why this one is important to you.
Well, this is one that I chose because of her. I mean, not only because the music is fantastic and she's very talented, but also just of her place in history, because she was like the one, basically the only woman who was part of this GRM group that worked with Pierre Schaeffer and took lessons with like Ligeti and all of these, composers. And she really wasn't so well known until recently with all of these re-releases and these new releases. And I think that she is as good as like Parmigiani, as good as Bale. I mean, she's just amazing. So I think that was one of the reasons I wanted to include this.
Do you remember how you first discovered her work?
Yeah, I actually had the pleasure of hearing this work diffused live through multiple speakers at a festival that I did. Yeah. Oh my gosh. It was amazing. It was like it was the best multi-speaker diffusion piece I've ever heard. She was mixing it live and it was just like really, really powerful. And then I was like, I don't even know who this person is. I've never heard of her, And of course I tried to talk to her, but we didn't speak the same language. So it was just like this really funny exchange, but I was trying to tell her like, oh my gosh, that was amazing. I have no idea if she understood what I was saying, but yeah, and I just was like, I think one of the things that I noticed about her work is that the subjects that she uses as her field recordings are kind of subtly different than like source recordings that, for instance, like Parmigiani would use.
Right.
So I think like the track that I really like is the La Babale de Chien Chien à la Mamère, which is the ball of the old lady's dog. And I just think it's first of all, it's just masterfully composed. Like it's just like kind of, there are moments where there's a reality that comes together of concrete sounds in a time and a place. And then there's a pivot all of a sudden she'll, have a recording of her own voice talking. And then all of a sudden, everything will just become atomized. And it's just like particles that just explode outward. And then they come back into this little moment in time and space with her dog. And there's something like, partly this is my own projection, but I kind of feel like there's a feminine approach to this because it's almost like a domestic scene or something. Like she's home with the dog, and even just the titles that she's using are very different from like, again, using one of my other favorites, Parmigiani, as an example. Like the title to one of his CD collections is called like the Creation of the World. It's that in French. And so instead of like the creation of the world, she's kind of like, this is my dog and I'm throwing a ball to the dog and you hear it like bounce on the floor. So it's almost like this totally different approach, which I love.
I didn't realize that was her dog. That's so cool.
I don't know. I mean, that's what I was assuming because I think that's her voice.
Right.
So I was assuming that's her dog. Yeah.
But that's doubly cool.
It's doubly cool because you can really hear I'm assuming it's her dog because the voice of the dog is like caught so intimately. Like
right.
It's amazing. I don't know how she got these recordings, but you can hear like the little details in this dog's voice and it's really cool.
Yeah. I mean, that's, I think, something that I haven't heard enough of Beatrice's work at all, but there's definitely the sense of like a personal experience coming through. Yeah. Like a lot of my experience with this electroacoustic kind of works often has this sort of attempted objective quality, like these sounds are just pulled from like a neutral space and treated quite neutrally as well. But yeah, this feels like writing on the back of a postcard or something. It's really nice.
Yes, that's exactly what I think too. And that's, it's almost like I think in a way she kind of reminds me a little bit of Luc Ferrari, who used more voices and things like that, but still they weren't like his work didn't really point to himself or like his own life or like one room or one place. Like you still kind of couldn't get a sense of like, where am I in this piece? But with this work, it's like, oh, I'm being pulled back. It's almost like, you're being pulled into this time and place and then shoved outside again and then pulled back in and push back out. And It's just a really cool, like, back and forth.
Yeah. As well, I don't know loads about her life, but one thing I did read, I think it was in connection to this release, had like a little biography, and it was like that she got involved in the GRM by accident. Do you know anything about that? Like, it sounds...
Yeah, I read that too. And no, I don't really know that much about... There isn't actually that much about this woman on the internet. I wish someone would do a biography on her. But no, I don't really know what... Oh, you know what I think it was, actually? That she was coming to study with Nathalie Boulanger, who was like this piano teacher to like all of these big composers of that time period. And I think that's how she became connected to these other composers.
Right.
So I think it was the Nathalie Boulanger. I believe that's her name. That was the connection. I think I read that.
Gotcha. I want to go back as well to something you said as well. And we were just talking about this personal inflection that she brings to work that can often eschew that a fair bit. I mean, is that something that you contemplate consciously within your own work? I mean, I think it's something that with at least a couple of your works I've felt quite prominently like this, projecting like definitely internal states. Is this a kind of energy that you think you bring into your music as well?
Yeah, I do. I mean, and I think like for a long time I was really, I mean, in a way I kind of included Beatriz Ferreira because I feel like I relate to her in some way because I kind of came up during this time when there weren't that many like other women doing what I was doing. And I was always like very conflicted about like, am I revealing too much emotion? Like, should I pull back on that? Should this be more clinical? Should this be more? So it was always like this internal dialogue that I had where if I was being too personal or too emotional, that I might be then relegated to this other,
right,
like category of like outsider women artists who weren't kind of in the canon or something.
Right, yeah.
So I kind of wonder, like, so that's why I love this so much, because she's just like, fuck it. I don't care. I'm putting my dog in here. And it's so cool. I mean, it's really interesting, so yeah. So I think so. I think I do think about that a lot.
One other thing that really intrigues me about this release you've picked is it collates 3 works from over like 17 years. So you've got one from 2001, one from 2007, and another from 2018. And I believe when I first listened, I didn't know that, but it didn't jar me that you had such a large stretch of time occurring, I think, But although when I read about which piece was allegedly like the more modern piece, I was like, okay, I feel like I can pick up on this, but they feel very unified. I mean, what is it that enables, from your view, like 3 pieces from such a stretch of time to share company so coherently?
That's a really good question. I mean, I think that there's a similar quality to all of them of this kind of suspension, of like a listening in a suspended field rather than like a field of like where things are developed in a really particular way. It's more about like this just being in a place, like, which I tend to gravitate more towards. I'd rather just like have a composer make a place for me to be in rather than a story for me to understand, or like I don't want to go on a journey necessarily. I just want to be somewhere.
Yes,
So
yeah.
I feel like that's what all of these 3 have in common, kind of.
Yeah, I love the way that this record plays with extremes. Like, I mean, this is something I think that comes really prominently within some of this GRM stuff as well. It's just that there are absolutely no fucks given when it comes to any decorum around the use of the stereo field, extremes in volume, silences. It's amazing, isn't it?
It is, and in a way, it kind of takes on some of the qualities of like what romantic music used to do. So like if you think of Beethoven and his sonatas, it was all like storm and stress, where like things would be super quiet and then really loud, and there would be like, and I mean, I remember when I was little, like, turning on the radio and like there would be a classical station, and it was like I couldn't even barely hear what was playing, and then all of a sudden there would just be like a timpani drum like really loud in my ear. And I feel like this is kind of taking on some of that dynamic nature of that kind of music, which I really appreciate. And I actually kind of feel like these multi-speaker diffusion concerts are kind of orchestral, just because these voices are happening from all around the room. So I kind of feel like this GRM music is orchestral in a way.
I think there are certain points as well when you talk about those dynamic contrasts where I was like, oh, is the track finished? And it's one of those experiences that make me realize I've been socialized to incessant noise within my music in order to tell me that it's still happening, which is kind of sad, but hey.
I know, it's true. And I've noticed, like, I even noticed this with my last record, the October 1984, that was included on some SoundCloud playlists. And I was like stupid enough to look at the comments, and there was like some comment of like this guy who was just like basically like putting like like, this is really slow. Like, he was just like putting a sloth on there, like, and I'm coming from this place of like, like the tradition of these composers where I just let things like play out over really long periods of times. And then, but it's changed. The landscape has changed. Like
right.
So it's just like, oh wow, I gotta speed things up for a second.
For the SoundCloud community. Yeah. I know it's always going to be often a film I'm going to like if someone comes away and they go, and you know what? Nothing happened. And I'm like, what, you mean the projector didn't turn on? Or what do you mean? It's always, always tantalizes me. I'm like,
me
well,
too.
something happened.
So that kind of like, then we should talk about the Feldman piece, because that statement really kind of goes into why I like that piece.
Yes.
So let's talk about that. Let's
do it. Yes. So for Samuel Beckett by Morton Feldman. Yeah. Tell me about why this one's important to you.
Well, it's one of my favorite orchestral pieces, and I like it precisely because if you're just listening kind of on the surface, it actually sounds like nothing's happening, or things are happening so slowly that you almost can't really tell that they're happening. But then if you listen closely, there's all of this detail that's kind of shifting back and forth, and sounds are staggered, and then they kind of come back together again. Like, so it's almost kind of reminds me of, when you listen to an orchestra tuning up, which is one of my favorite sounds, like how there's so much happening, but actually nothing happening, because the stuff that's happening is just happening so consistently, or patterns kind of return that it's almost like monolithic. And I think that's what this Feldman piece reminds me of.
Yeah. I mean, that's such a great analogy, because as well, this is like an orchestra that never tunes up, like, for the entire time.
Exactly.
Oh,
yeah. And it's interesting, because I was like really obsessed with learning how he could do that with an orchestra. I just couldn't figure it out. And I finally got a hold of this score. I got a hold of this score, and then another score for this, another piece called Coptic Light. Yeah. And it was so interesting to look at the score, because I think I was naive in that I thought that it would just be a lot of stuff that repeated, but it wasn't at all. It was like really like just things would ever so slightly change. And like there was all of this kind of interval stuff where like the intervals between notes would change very gradually.
Oh,
and
wow.
like, yeah, it was really beautiful. It really was like reading a complex, like I think he called the other piece Coptic Light that I was just talking about that sounds kind of similar to this one. I think he called it Coptic Light because of some kind of weaving technique. And that is exactly what the score is like. It's just like things are kind of being woven in and out really, really delicately and carefully. And there are all these details that just kind of come in and out. And then after I saw that, I was just like, it was just a revelation, and I could kind of listen to it differently.
So is it like really rigorously scored?
Oh, absolutely. It is. It's so rigorous that, I mean, this guy was obsessive, first of all, about dynamics. Like it's never just like pianissimo PP. It's like P, 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 you know, it's like, it's almost like he's being a little bit controlling with the dynamics. And he also did things like, he had all the string players, because it's a really string forward piece. Like it's like just a lot of like a big washy string sections, but he had all of the string players put these clamp mutes on the strings so that the strings would not like ring out. They would just be really quiet and muted.
Oh, wow.
Which kind of makes the whole piece in a way, because if you do orchestral pieces and you use a lot of strings, they're actually really loud. Like it's hard, even if you have a string section playing pianissimo, it's still going to be loud. And there's like some kind of like natural dynamics that are there that he kind of takes away by having them put these mutes on. And so there's just all of these little, it's really like dynamically, especially controlled. Like that was like his whole thing was just like quiet, you know, very static kind of dynamics throughout.
Oh, that's so cool.
Yeah.
And the idea of a clamp as well is perfect, right? It's just like this kind of stifled half motion that can't complete. Oh, so good.
Exactly. Yeah.
Do you remember how you came into Feldman's work?
Oh gosh, that's a hard one, because I think I've known about his work for a long time. He kind of became the go-to composer for like people like me who were doing weird music and making things with field recordings that were kind of like spacious. Like it was like, yeah, it was like Phil Niblock, you know, Morton Feldman, like just people like that. Like a lot of my friends were like, oh, you have to listen to this guy. Like this guy really, he's just got, he gets it. Like he gets the whole space thing. And so that's how and at first I think it was just like listening to some piano works like Triadic Memories or something like that. Mm-hmm. And then I think my friend Seth Neal, who's also a composer, like turned me on to this piece. And then I was like, whoa, this is like something else. Cause it was just lush. It was like, I think some of his other kinds of pieces are a little bit too stark for me. Like they're just so austere and cold and kind of like, but this is like, it has that kind of austere quality, but it's like lush strings, you know, so it's kind of this weird combination of those two things.
Yeah. And I understand as well, I don't really know much about the chronology of his work, but this one is shorter as well. So it's like 45 minutes, which I think sounds like a bit more of a merciful duration for Feldman, right?
And that's true. And it's kind of reminds me of how, I mean, first of all, 45 minutes for an orchestral piece is long. It's really not really long, but it kind of reminds me of like, I have friends who are in noise bands, and, you know, the whole noise genre, like every song is just like a minute long because it's so loud that there's like a ratio of like loudness to time. And I think this is just the opposite, where there's like this ratio of like quietness to time that some composers have, where they're just like, it's really quiet and it's gonna be really long. So what I think is, when I experience this stuff live, it's really hard to deal with, actually. Like I don't find, like, I mean, if I could ever hear this piece live, I would just be there in a minute. But with some other kinds of Feldman pieces, I don't actually enjoy hearing them live because they're so quiet. I feel like I can't move, and I become very like self-conscious, and they're so long, and it's just like, ugh, this is a drag. So it's just, there's that whole durational element in this kind of music that's always present, and I'm I think he must have known that there's some difficulty in going through that entire duration.
Yeah, especially because I feel like the way that he constructs music avoids any indicators that might tell you how long you've been listening for. So
yes,
you can be halfway down and be like,
you
have I
don't
been
know.
in for 3 hours or
And so that's not only just true for the audience, but that's also true for the performers. Apparently this is very difficult to perform because it's really easy to get lost. Like you just don't, and once you get lost, it's hard to, like, there are no obvious cues, because if you think about orchestral music, you think about like, okay, something happens and then something else happens, and that drum thing could be a cue. Like,
yes,
when that timpani thing happens, like the trumpet will come in. So like maybe you get lost. I mean, I hope you don't, but if you do,
listen for the timpani.
You could use that as a cue. But in this, there's nothing like that. I mean, it's just a landscape painting. Like it's just like getting lost in a desert or something.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. I guess as well, it's something that superficially, I think, and maybe knowingly, you probably know Feldman's work better than I do, but like knowingly adopts the superficial presence of something that wasn't composed. So feels like something on first listen you could be like, oh, they're just parking when they feel like it. Yeah, like,
right.
Which
Exactly.
again must really scramble you, where it's these notes that come in at kind of this non-linear point, like not necessarily on any discernible beat. It's like,
right. And that's the amazing, I mean, that's the crazy thing about these scores. It's like everything is just ridiculously metrical. Like everything is counted. There's no, like, and that was one of the reasons I wanted to study the score too, because I was kind of like, I became interested in making orchestral music, but I was kind of coming from this place of working with like improvisers and things. So all of this kind of formation, the one that you're referring to, of kind of like this openness, whenever I had encountered that, it was always just kind of by accident, or just by saying like, this is the vibe we're going to go for. This is the kind of space we want. And in this case, it was just like, wow, this is completely scored to the just tiniest little note, and that was just amazing to me.
And it's called For Samuel Beckett. So how much do you know about Beckett's work?
Well, I mean, I think like this whole idea of waiting and not knowing, like when things need to end, or like the lack of any like signposts or cues or anything is very like Beckett, right? Yeah. Like, I mean, I've seen the Waiting for Godot play. I haven't read any of his other works, but just even from that play, it's all about just duration, time, and yeah. Are you familiar with his writing?
No, see, this is it. I think Waiting for Godot is the only thing that I've encountered. I've listened to like an audio play of that, and again, kind of absorb some of the themes, and I think enough to feel like when I saw that this was for Samuel Beckett, that I could see some kind of alignment going on there. But
exactly, it just makes sense. Yeah,
there was a cool review of this actually that I found, where it was like, it sounds like the players have run short of possibilities and are reduced to making the same moves again and again. And then it says, in chess the game ends with checkmate. In For Samuel Beckett, the game horrifyingly never ends.
Exactly.
Which is,
it never ends. Until it does. Until all of a sudden it does. Well, and it's over.
I was going to say, because the ending is it's quite abrupt, if I recall right. It just kind of stops, right?
Totally.
Love
Yeah,
it.
so in a way, it kind of reminds me of like what they say about your memory of time. Like if you think about, and this I guess is kind of like Beckett like too, but if you think about being in these poor people who have to be in prison for, all of these many, many years, and it's not even addressing like what they did to get there or something, but just the experience of like being in that kind of environment where you do the same thing every day, and the days kind of run together. You look, when you're doing that, it feels like, it's just endless. But then maybe when you look back, like you don't remember any details. So it's a completely different kind of idea of like what time was. Whereas
Right.
like you are in a situation where all of these different things are happening and things are changing all the time, like later on you might feel like that was longer than it actually was or something. So in a way, like this piece is kind of like that. It's like being in a prison of sound. I'm kidding, not. It's a beautiful piece. So
Olivia, one more question for you, actually, which is, I read in a previous interview how I think someone asked about what music you've been listening to, and I think this may have been around like 2017, but you said that actually what you do more of is buy micro cassettes on eBay and listen to those. What does your listening look like now? Is that still the case? Do you listen to a lot of music now?
I'm happily out of the micro cassette phase, because that was starting to become like a very expensive habit. And it's also like costly in terms of space. I just have so many of these tapes, like I can't do that anymore. So thankfully that's over. I was also in like a shortwave radio phase where all I did was listen to shortwave radio, and I'm out of that phase. And right now I'm kind of just listening to, this record that's out now, and then the next record that's coming out after that is just like going to be way more melodic. So I'm just thinking a lot more about melody. So I'm just listening to like pop music that I like, and things like there's actually a record I really love that I was going to include on this list, but I didn't, just because there were, only so many I could do. But it's this re-release from this Korean singer, and the release is called Now, and it's just like one of the, I gotta find her name, let me see what it is. But it's like one of the best like psychedelic pop records I've ever heard, and I was just like had that on repeat for a long time during the pandemic. Yeah, her name is Kim Jung-mi, and the record is called Now. So I was just really into that record because of the melodies and the way that the songs are structured. So it's kind of just like, just kind of melodies and pop music right now.
Awesome, nice. I'll include that as a honorable mention in the show notes. Nice. Well, Olivia, thank you so much. This has been so nice to speak about your record and 3 absolute stormers as well in terms of important records. So thank you very much.
Thank you. It's been fun.
And to everyone listening, I'll see you next time. Goodbye.
Bye.